Yes, sir. So, a warm welcome to everyone. Good evening. This is indeed a very exciting occasion for CWS as we celebrate our 30th anniversary. It's another milestone. It's another feather in the cap of CWS. And we thought at this occasion to celebrate the science and conservation that CWS has done since 1984. We will hold a session where we listen to CWS's founder, Dr. Ullas Karanth, where we would hear from him the trajectory of the organization, the growth of the organization over the years, the fantastic science and science-based conservation interventions that the organization has done. But before getting into that, just a bit of an overview about CWS. CWS Center for Wildlife Studies is an internationally recognized center for excellence in arenas of wildlife research, conservation policy, and education. It was started in 1984, and of course, in this particular webinar, we will hear more about that. But more importantly, CWS since 2020 have been doing these online webinars. Earlier, it used to be in person, but because of the pandemic, that has become a huge challenge. So we have been doing these online webinars where we discuss various pertinent issues in conservation and scientific research. And you can log on to our website if you would like to contribute to any of our projects, or write to outreach@cwsindia.org. So just coming back to what I was mentioning, today we are organizing this session to hear from Dr. Karanth about the wonderful, productive, and challenging journey of CWS over the last 38 years, close to 4 decades now. And without much ado, I welcome Dr. Ullas Karanth to today's webinar. Welcome, sir.
Pleasure to be here.
A lot of people, so when we were initially thinking of having this webinar, a lot of people actually had questions about how it all started. And I'm sure the audience are waiting and looking forward to hear from you about that. Could you please tell us about the inception of CWS in the year 1984, sir?
Actually, the inception was not a grand event or something that I thought of establishing like an institution. It was purely for convenience. To go back a bit, I have always been a naturalist. I have always loved wildlife. I have wandered in the Western Ghats starting from 1967, even earlier, but Nagarhole, Kudremukh was 1965, Nagarhole was 1967, Bhadra was 1972. So I've been going to these places, and I was a passionate naturalist by the age 8. So essentially, this is what I wanted to do as a career. But when I got out of PUC in 1965, I had good grades, but I had absolutely zero chance of being a wildlife biologist. So you either became a doctor or an engineer, and I chose the engineering stream thinking wildlife will be my hobby. And it was my hobby for many years until in fact, in second year engineering, I read Dr. Schaler's article in Life magazine, and I said, eventually, this is what I want to do, science-based conservation. I read every hunting book. This was the first exposure to how a scientist finds out information that's then applied to conservation. So that opened my eyes. So I started assembling my articles, publishing articles in different journals, and then I did a survey of Bhadra Sanctuary on a princely grant of 500 rupees from WWF in 1978, and that was followed by, that kind of boosted my ambition. I spent nearly a year wandering around in patches, getting a grant of 25,000 from Department of Environment in Karnataka those days, to do a survey of lion-tailed monkeys in the Western Ghats of Karnataka. This again was triggered because Stephen Green who was a professor in Miami. At that time, he was not a professor in Miami. He was a PhD student. He later became a PhD guide to, I think, Rennie Borges later in Miami. But he kind of did a quick survey and claimed land-tailed monkeys were virtually extinct in Karnataka, except in Malay Mane and Agumbe. And I knew that wasn't true. I had seen them and I knew what the species was. So I took it as a challenge and did a survey. At that point in time, I think it was D.K. Subramanian, who was then the additional secretary. He was a computer scientist from IISc, he said, Ullas, we were very good friends. So he said, you should establish something instead of, putting money into bank accounts. It's all complicated. So that's how CWS got started as purely a matter of convenience in 1984 as a trust based in Mysore. Just to add, when you start a trust, I'm talking 84, you need somebody you trust. That's the idea. It is not that, there's a way of starting it, getting VIPs, getting grants, and that's not what I had in mind. I wanted something small, functional that I could. And so the two persons I could really think of, one was my father-in-law, Pratibha's father, was an incredible labor lawyer in Chennai. He was a Royist along with S.R. Bommai. They were all B.M. Tarkunde. They were the first Royists in India, M.N. Roy's followers. And the other person was someone who had mentored me when I was a farmer, Ajit Vambatkere. He was a grandson of the first ICS officer from Karnataka who got ICS in 1902. So these were not only my mentors, but people of high value. So we started a trust, and then that's how CWS took birth.
In some sense, you touched upon it in between.
Sorry, I missed the question. Can you repeat?
Yes, sir. So for a lot of people, in some sense, CWS also resonates as the hub of tiger research, where we have had this remark.
I'm losing your voice a bit, Sreedhar. And let me see if I can turn up my. Oh, okay, I'll turn up my. Okay, can you repeat?
Yeah. So in some sense, you actually touched upon what I wanted to ask next, which is about the LTM service, because for a lot of people, CWS has been the center for tiger research because of its remarkable 3-decade-long research and conservation of tigers in some key landscapes in the Western Ghats. But before we get into that, could you just particularly on the
Again, for some reason, I'm losing parts of your sentences, so this is going to be a bit slow. So what was the second half? I understood the tiger part. What was the second part of the question?
So I was basically early surveys, including that of the lion-tailed monkeys.
Yeah, see, the thing was, I was very interested in, initially, only thing I could do in Puttur was bird watching. So by 8, I was a proficient bird watcher. But I was interested in everything. And, in 1974 in Bhagwati, I saw the Malabar civet. So there was all this stuff. And so the tiger came later. I always had an interest. And what I realized was that doing field work, being actually on the ground and getting data was very different from reading books. Now, or historical accounts or just sitting behind a computer and modeling. I think that ground level connect has to be the core of good science, wildlife science. That I realized when I met these incredible people on these foot surveys. Like I met a tribal guy in Kumbar, which is south of the Shiradi, who had seen 2 Nilgiri martins collar and kill a mouse deer. These kind of things you hear, you see, that on-field experience is critical, which a lot of people are now gradually losing sight of. So to me, that was the foundation. You are muted, I think.
You mentioned that at one point there was this notion that the lion-tailed monkeys had gone extinct. And what were the findings of your early survey on the lion-tailed macaques?
That's published in a, I sent my findings to, see, it was a questionnaire survey, although I did see monkeys in some places, but I had seen them earlier also in several places. And but the questionnaire survey showed there was a very large population, probably over 1,000 or something. I used a very crude definition, but the point is, even when you do a questionnaire survey, I was trying to look for a species that was very conspicuous, very different from other monkeys and anything else. In spite of that, unless you went in and talked to some MF, this was the days when there was still hunting, not focused hunting of lion-tailed monkeys, but a lot of hunting and everything was scarce and shy. If you talk to an agricultural farmer, not very far from the rainforest, he knew only bonnet macaque and langur, Hanuman langur. Nobody knew about this. Only you had to go and find the poachers or the MFP collectors. They would know about this other species of monkey. That was in some sense, that unless data collected from random individuals can be deeply flawed because they don't know what they're talking about. So that was lesson number one. Lesson number two was, when you do interview surveys, you have to have deep knowledge of the local culture and language and all that. So I was very proficient in Kannada and Tulu, and I could understand Byari, I could understand Kodava, I could understand Konkani, so I was fine. But if you didn't have that nuanced approach, just doing a structured survey, going there with a bleeding heart and talking to some guy, it doesn't really get you accurate information if you are doing information-based surveys. And you need to have field knowledge of what you're looking for, etc. So all these things are, they can't be learned in a classroom. That's what I'm trying to get at, because too many young biologists today think it's all on the internet or in the classroom or listening to some social scientists pontificating. No, you got to be there. You got to pick it up ground upwards.
I think I completely agree with you on that, sir. And I think that's a great take home for a lot of young scholars who are just starting off with be it ecological surveys or social science surveys, because the key, I think, is spending time out there on field, trying to understand the nuances.
Yeah, and also not being a scholar, being a naturalist first, and aim for scholarship towards after 60. Everybody starts as a scholar. That's the problem nowadays.
That's another a key learning, I guess. So people really don't want to be a learner, I guess. They start off as scholars. You have rightly mentioned that, sir.
No, I'm saying something slightly different, Sreedhar, which is, if you go and see, there are naturalists, some of these tourist lodges or amateurs who are actually very good naturalists. But the people who are getting into the professions don't have the same passion, don't have the same on-ground. I'm not saying that should be the end all. It should be the foundation to be a good wildlife scientist. Sorry, I think I'm taking you off what you wanted to ask me.
Not at all, sir. I think this is also, in some sense, a key learning from the whole the baseline of founding this organization is also based on the passion, becoming a naturalist, going out and exploring the forest, and that is for a lot of us. That's how we've got into this field. The passion for particular landscapes, the passion for particular species, and so on, and just be out there and observe and learn. That's what has brought many of us here. So I think this is really important for the younger generation, particularly. So just as a follow up on that, I think now I think I really want to hear more, or I'm sure the audience also wants to hear more about the tiger research and conservation in the country. CWS has contributed immensely to that over the past 38 years. And we would love to hear from you about the trajectory of this long-term project, perhaps the only one of its kind across the globe to monitor these big cat populations in some key landscapes. Could you please tell us more about that?
Yeah, see, I was always fascinated by tigers because, my father read me Jim Corbett's books. He read me Frank Buck's Bring Them Back Alive. And he was a good naturalist who had seen one tiger in the 1930s in Kotshadri when he was a young man. And then I showed him a second one with a radio collar on 60 years later. But I was fascinated by tigers. It's a childhood thing. We had the Holy Vesha tradition. We had Pili Bhuta, which is the tiger god. All sorts of things. I was very focused. That was very clear to me. And the other person who told me this is Valmiki Thapar. For some reason, tiger is something different. In a sense, you feel a connect. Whatever the psychology of it, I got an opportunity to actually be a tiger biologist much later. But again, I did all this wandering around natural history, talking to tiger hunters, etc. So that was the foundational thing. And I especially sought after tiger hunters because they knew more, at least among Indians, because we have no interest in natural history, or at least my generation and the preceding generations. They're only elevating about their souls and things like that. Normal things didn't interest me. Natural history is not a part of the Indian or Chinese DNA or culture of the DNA. We are interested in improving one species ourselves. So, this tiger thing was really in my blood, and George Haller's article triggered it in a certain. I had read every tiger hunting book. It triggered me in a direction that you ask questions, you frame it, you collect data, quantitative data. You read Deer and the Tiger, much of what we know about tigers is kind of there already. In 1963, he did the field study. So I pursued that, and CWS was a vehicle. To me, let me be very clear. For me, whether it was CWS or something else, so my early tiger research was done in CWS in 1986 and 88, my master's data collection, etc. I was lucky to get Sunquist as my advisor. Later in 88, George met me in University of Florida and hired me. So I was able to join WCS. So whichever label you use is not important for me because the work we have done, funded by WCS, Fish and Wildlife Service, CWS was the instrument through which much of it was implemented. And I would kind of put it in three phases. I would at least highlight what I think was different or important. Number one was after Schaller, who looked at predator-prey, looking at both prey and tigers. The typical Western wildlife biologists studying tigers or anything else, they only focus on the cats. There's so little attention on the prey. How much there is, but that's actually the driver. That's what determines how many cats are there, how they're spaced, how they behave. It's all driven by cats are where the cat food is. So nobody was interested in the cat food. So except Schaller in his original study. So I was very focused on that. So to me, the real issue was how do you find out how much tiger food is? And that led to, really, and the government surveys of prey, censuses, this was all nonsense and it continues to be nonsense. But application of distance sampling methods, which started with Leopold, but sort of went into formal model under Charlie Gates, David Anderson. I was connecting with David Anderson in 87 as a graduate student. So, the application of line transects and estimation of herbivore ungulate numbers, prey numbers in reliable way was a serious scientific contribution in Asia, and very few places in the world people had done this. So, that's something was a landmark. And I would say once you get, then your mind is blown away, because you start studying tigers, you put in collars and you know what they're eating, how many they're eating, roughly 50 prey a year, and you suddenly realize some of the places like Kana, Kaziranga, Nagarhole have so much prey. These must be supporting the highest tiger densities in the world. And even with home ranges, when I collared the first tigress, measured her home range, it was 20 square kilometers. My colleague, who started 6 years later, Dale Mikkel, collared tigresses in Russia, it was 600 square kilometers, 30 times. So it all fell into place in a way. So telemetry, I didn't do anything original. We adapted the Chitwan method for catching free-ranging tigers. I still think, other than darting tourist-habituated tigers by approaching them on gypsies, this is the only way you can effectively catch tigers. So that capture itself was a very interesting experience. What drugs to use, how do you set up a beat, and Mr. Chinnappa being there like the master naturalist, Mel Sundquist, us doing some of the sitting on a 3-meter high branch and darting a tiger that comes and hoping it's not a female with cubs. These were exciting moments, but that was an adaptation of a science that already existed. And the real contribution, I think, to science was meshing camera trap photography with capture recapture, which again is a partnership with Jim Nichols. I was lucky to meet him when I was a graduate student in 1989 in Florida, just after I finished. So these were some of the landmarks. And the last benchmark thing we did, I think, which is truly important, people have been asking the question, where are the animals? And what you do is go around. You use a questionnaire survey, you look for tracks, you do something. And when you say the animal is present, you mark on a map, it's present here. And if you don't hear anything about it, or see no sign, or don't see animals, or don't hear the voice, you say it's absent. This is how surveys have been done. In Africa, it's called atlasing. Actually, it's a huge problem, because there is a category of places you go where the animal may be present, but you did not see it. Now, this problem had not been cracked. And I think it was in 1997 when we organized the tiger prey monitoring workshop with Jim Nichols, Lex Sebi, all the smart people. And, our officers, WI people, Dr. Jala, everybody was there. So Jim came up with the solution how we can use this in a capture recapture framework. It was the very early edition was called the Nichols Karanth model. It was actually using capture recapture, the concept of capture recapture to occupancy. To me, again, we published this in the kind of, Jim invented it, I helped them. 97, by 99, it was 2002, it was published non-peer reviewed. By 2006, that field had taken off. So to me, the real interesting thing is science is universal, like physics and all these molecular biologists in their expensive labs pretending that they are doing very important things. What we do is equally important, and it's equally as good as physics or anything. It's a much more complex systems we are studying. So that's been the excitement of doing tiger science for me.
So I think that pretty much connects well to what I wanted to ask next, which is that the whole challenge of understanding the predator-prey relationships and getting into robust population estimates rather than what are called as census techniques. So for the longest, monitoring of most species has been a huge challenge. And what could you tell us what have been some of the advancements in this over the years, and how that has helped arrive at robust estimates of wildlife populations?
Yeah, see, one of the things is when you look at animal populations, you are looking at very complicated things. The natural dynamics is very complicated. But the traditional science, the top quality science, say in medicine or many of these situations, the rigorous science is defined by what Platt called, in 64 paper, statistical inference of the highest level comes from experiments, randomization, treatments, replication. We have none of that when you study a tiger population over 25,000 square kilometers or any of our situations. So after 1980 or 82, people started in this field, particularly Lee Eberhard, George Sieber, who was a New Zealander, thought about these issues and started thinking of inferential methods for these kind of data, which are not structured experiments with all the necessary rigor, because you'll never ever get there if that's the way you want to go. You can pretend you can, but you can't. So there are two kinds of statistics happening, even now happening. There are people who simply use Fisher's old linear regression type of things, throw everything into it like a laundry machine, and it throws up a pattern and call it great science. I don't think it is. It does not mechanistically explain whatever is on your X and Y axis. Actually, there is a cause and effect at all. Whereas if you collect observation data that can generate mechanistic explanations because you have understood the phenomena and constructed your models, to me, that was the first thing. Second thing, with Jim Nichols, I suddenly understood, unlike someone in a lab working at things, when you're out in the field surveying animals, there is this big ghost that is haunting you called imperfect detection. You don't see every animal that's there when you do a transit. When you put cameras, you don't see every tiger that's out there. You catch some of them. How do you estimate the proportion that you missed? So dealing with imperfect detection has been, again, a serious methodological progress, and much of this was not very tractable until fast computers came, coding came, programming came, where you could emulate or simulate what was happening on the ground. And the second step was, first was likelihood-based kind of things, then the Bayesian kind of things. So this field has really exploded. And when I joined as a formal field biologist, luckily I came from engineering. I was not scared of numbers. Most of my peers were scared of numbers. They were good naturalists, good thinkers, but all this whole field of this new thing that Sieber and Eberhard and others had started they were not very comfortable. They would use standard regression, all this stuff, Fisher stuff, which is not relevant to our data. It's great stuff, multivariate statistics. It's not relevant to what we were trying to answer. So to me, that connect between good, robust field data, understanding as best as you can from your experience and knowledge of the species, that has to come from species biology. You can't apply randomly. I read a paper in PNAS where said you can go to a website and estimate the population of every bird species in the world. Obviously, it's nonsense, but it gets published in PNAS. So that connect of robust natural history, mechanistic understanding of species behavior or species habitat interactions, and using the best possible methods. The last bit keeps evolving because we are getting better and better at all these other fields. For example, we used to watch animals now. You can use pattern recognition for easily ID things. So there's a technical component in the technology sense. There's a growing component in the IT programming side. There's deep statistical thinking, Bayesian and others going in. And the brick that has to go into all this is the good old natural history we do. So it's been a really exciting field for me in the last 30 years. And now, of course, these people are leaving me in the dust. Some of the smartest people, I have to take someone's help to understand what they're doing. But it's happy to see this happening. And it's happening because of peer review, because science is valued. If you think science is dictated by some bureaucratic pope, then we will never progress down this path.
I think that's a fantastic take on that, because doing robust science, but based on your understanding of natural history, really makes a huge difference, and that I think, following up on the earlier points that you raised, is another key takeaway for our audience here. So that said, I think it is also really important to understand many of these ecological processes, species population dynamics, etc., over long terms, and it is seldom that we actually have long-term ecological monitoring projects, particularly in countries like India. And what, according to you, are some of the major challenges in long-term ecological research and conservation programs?
See, macroecology, that is ecology done across large temporal, spatial scales and large, long temporal scales, becomes very essential when you are looking at species that live long, use a lot of space, have long generation times, and there is no substitute other than doing these kind of macroecological studies. They cannot be done on 2-year permits. They cannot be done on, in fact, if you have to really understand metapopulation dynamics of some of these species to get a deeper understanding, you can't say, I'll give you an answer as to what you want to do next week or things like that. It is a foundational thing, like the understanding of electronics led to today's computer revolution and whatever everybody is, from gaming to whatever. The basics have to be understood. And in our field, it's very complicated. Situations are different, species. So we need a lot more of those long. If you're studying Drosophila in a lab, no problem. They turn over quickly. You have your paper in Nature next week and have your beer to celebrate it. But if you're studying species that are long-lived, live across large landscape, the collection of the bricks, the basic data takes time, analysis, the patterns, it's a long-term, lifelong commitment to some people. That's the kind of science, unfortunately, is not encouraged because people are impatient or people are not smart enough to understand what it is. So, but because they have power and authority, they decide they know. They most often don't. So we have wonderful opportunities in India to do this kind of research. And the wonderful opportunities are for your generation, you and younger generation. But they are kept out of doing this. Essentially, the systems, even if you say, this is what I want to learn, if you are a molecular geneticist or parked in one of these big institutions, you ask for 50 crores, the government will write a check next day. But if you want to do something as exciting, as important, perhaps certainly more important for conservation, in the outdoors, you are regulated in so many ways, you are discouraged in so many ways, and your funding opportunities are so less. But this is a field where India is green field. It is open. We have rich biodiversity. We have effective protected areas thanks to the hard work of foresters of the 1970s and 80s and 90s. We have these amazing laboratories, but the laboratory is locked. So this to me is a big challenge. I have tried to face it in my own way, rough and crude ways in my lifetime. But unless there is a structured understanding from higher up as to how we can really treat this seriously, like we do genetics or IT or biotechnology or something else, I am a little saddened that the younger people have so many more barriers. See, in my generation, there were barriers. It's not, I had to fight court cases forever to keep my research going, but it was not of the kind we see now. What I faced was either, oh, what you do doesn't interest me. Then there were two parts. I don't care what you do. Go do what you want. It doesn't bother me. And some people saying, okay, it's not necessary and useful to me for this month's budget planning or something. So I dealt with those problems. Now, what the next generation are feeling is, we know everything. All the data is there. So, which is like claiming perfection already. So there's no way you can learn anything new. We have already learned everything new. And this is a characteristic of government bureaucrats, government scientists, once they are parked in a government institute. And it's very sad, because a country our size, we need thousands of field biologists. And they have to be in research institutions, they have to be in universities, they have to be in government institutions. We are turning it into some kind of a know-all monopoly, and that disturbs me deeply. And if it had happened in physics or chemistry or biotechnology or other fields, those fields have application and they earn money. So immediately the top scientists in those fields will rush in and defend their field. Unfortunately, we are not considered that kind of science, because we don't generate profits for anybody. We advance understanding. The buzzword sustainability possibly is useful because of the stuff we do, but it's a different situation. And I'm a little saddened about young people trying to do what I'm saying everybody should be doing, which is studying these large-scale problems, about endangered species with conservation challenges. So it's becoming harder and harder, although on paper we are becoming a very scientific country.
I think just to add on to that, in addition to all the bureaucratic hurdles and the restrictions or regulations that one has to face while doing field research and conservation, is also the huge challenge of fundraising to some certain extent, particularly if one wants to, say, have a long-term population monitoring program. I guess a lot of conservation funding bodies are probably interested in instant solutions, be it human-wildlife conflict, be it conservation of threatened species in critical habitats and so on. Nobody really has the patience, I guess, to invest time and money and effort into supporting these long-term initiatives, which I think adds on to the existing set of challenges for this generation of field biologists.
Well, I think there's enough money in the government, in the donor sector. It's a question of people who make decisions understanding the importance of this. And I see the gap is there rather than absolute shortage of money. Because if you look at MOE of budgets or whatever, there's no shortage of money per se. There's supposed to be a biodiversity mission of some several thousand crores roaring down the track. So I don't see shortage of money per se as the problem. It is misallocation of money and ignoring these critical pieces of research. And I don't think it's even bad intentions. It's more really not understanding what is it that someone like you, for example, is trying to do. And that education at the higher level is very hard. See, atomic energy, we had MGK Menon, or we had Raja Ramanna. There were people right at the top who understood the Swaminathan in agriculture. These guys could take it right up. Unfortunately, in our field, we have scientists, but they don't go to that level. Or we have people who are experts within quotes, who have access, who don't have a clue as to what is really important and not. So that's really the thing. But that's a subset of the problem, that if you look at the larger scientific community in India, because conservation science is non-profit, and also it poses some really inconvenient questions about balancing human interest versus wildlife interest, which a study of Drosophila doesn't. So for all these reasons, it's very hard to advocate the cause of what I and you or maybe some others in the audience think is the kind of science that's needed. But every generation has to fight its battles. You guys have to do yours.
Very good. So I think just following up on that before we move on to taking questions from the.
We have 4 more minutes, so
yes,
I'm watching my
this
clock.
This is the last question. So before we start taking questions from the audience.
Sorry, I missed what you said. I'm not hearing you, Vijay. Yeah. I'm just not hearing you. I lost you. Maybe Vinny can repeat your question.
I'll just go ahead and ask you the question. So the last question is, before we start taking questions from the public, what are some of the major challenges for wildlife conservation in the country going forward?
Well, that's a huge question. So I will not, it's probably take me 3 hours to answer it, but I would pose it this way. We have a country of 3 million square kilometers. We still have about 15 to 20% of it in reasonably, I'm not saying natural state, but somewhat preserved or at least prevented from being encroached, etc. 15, 20, whatever percent. So all these natural areas, probably only about 1 or 2% is still having its original complement of the most threatened species. Rest of it, there is scope for bringing back wildlife. So I always use this word, we have room for 15,000 tigers in India. So I don't think everything is gone at all. There is tremendous scope in spite of this because of 3 things. Because of the tremendous effort done between 1970, 1990s by Indian foresters, Indira Gandhi's laws, the first generation conservationists, maybe later in the 90s, some of us in the 2nd or 3rd generation. So there is a capital built up there. So there is no reason to lose hope. Now, if you have to grow outwards and bring back wildlife, which is the motif of CWS, Rewild India, we need to be very clear. This can't be done by winding the clock back, saying, okay, let's go back to, living the way some ancestor did in 1400, 1200 AD, 800 AD, whatever, pick some, just do time travel back and, India with 1.3 billion will do fine. No, every election, every democratic aspiration is for progress, for material progress. People may say other things for ideological reasons, but if you look at the people and talk to them, they want modernity, they want technology, they want better ways of life. So if you have to balance these two, technologically, we have to move forward. We cannot reject technology. We cannot say we had a solution 800 years ago, how water was tapped or how some variety was grown. No, our dams, all the big dams in India have lifespans of a century. One by one, they are filling up. How are you going to produce food? Can we keep dumping more chemicals and pesticides, or we have to design plants to address this problem? Fundamentally, energy. How are we going to produce energy? By carpeting the country with microhydels and solar panels and wind power. So there is no room for nature either in rainforests or in the desert. Or are we going to use something more efficient and safe like nuclear energy? There are these big questions we have to ask. And how is the economy going to run around this natural India with 15,000 tigers? Is it going to be one vast bureaucracy with posts being created for every dollar put in the budget, or are we going to be smarter and use the initiative of people and enterprise? So these are all things we have to think of, because nature cannot be saved in isolation from these. And one thing I'm convinced is science and technology are the solution, not the problem. They have their byproducts which are bad. But going back to the past does not solve any problem, although little solutions can be found for specific problems. So this is how I would approach conservation.
Thank you, sir. I think that was pretty elaborate. I think the key is to understand the importance of science and technology.
So we're done, right? So
we'll just, there are a couple of questions from the audience that Vinny has just shared with me.
Okay.
I'm just going to move on to those questions, sir. One is about your initial surveys in the 1970s and 80s. So in one of your responses, you were mentioning about how you approached poachers for interviews. And this question is particularly about, particularly asking about their willingness in sharing information about wildlife and their experiences, and whether any hesitation considering there were potentials of conviction at a later stage.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. When we're doing this lion-tailed monkey and various other questionnaire surveys, if you went in a jeep and looked like quasi-official, then you won't get answers. You just need to walk in, talk to people, and they'll talk to you. They'll tell you what they did. There are two kinds of people. See, there are some who are still at that time. I'm talking of 80s when poaching was still there. It was waning, but it was still quite strong. One ride between Bhagamandala and Kutta, I saw some 8 or 9 groups with guns and dogs going hunting. So I'm still talking of those days. If they were engaged in it still, then it's more dicey. But if it is history you're talking about, like there was this guy called Naribodi Chengappa, who had shot 27 tigers sitting in his village near Kurchi in Kodagu. He would talk freely about what he did because it's kind of history, and he was doing it for legal bounties of 100 rupees for a tiger shot. So, one very interesting incident was MD Madhusudan was one of my research assistants, and he went and talked to one of our poaching surveys. He talked to this guy. We published this paper in Ambio. He explained how he poached, how he had poached, etc. It was fine. This was years ago. But halfway through or towards the end of the interview, his son or somebody came and chased Madhusudan away and told his dad not to talk. So these are the problems where it's illegal. But you go to Laos, you go to Cambodia, many of these countries, you talk, even Nagaland, those, people would tell. There was no peril to divulging information. Maybe I went on for too long anyway. Okay.
The other question that we have is regarding your point about how there is enough funding available, but there is in some sense a misallocation happening there. And the question is, how can we convince people, the policy makers, that our science is just as important, and make sure that there is right allocation of funds and resources?
That's a tough one to answer. See, the official channels for doing it are the National Board for Wildlife, where there is representation for, non-officials. There is the boards of Wildlife Institute of India, various bodies. We have the Niti Aayog. These are all supposed to be ideas factories for the government. And for example, we have the Vision Group on Science and Technology in Karnataka. But these are filled with experts who come from fields that generate profits. So for example, the Vision Group on Science and Technology is IT and BT guys in Karnataka. And pretty much one is that problem. This is not even recognized as something that needs special expertise. The other problem is a lot of these advisory bodies and committees are filled with people who the bureaucracy views as pliant people who will say yes to everything, have their boxed lunch and take their tea and go. If there's somebody who throws challenges and questions, this is true of government science institutions also. I was on the board of WII for 2 terms. So I'm not saying it is only the officials, it's even the government science institutions have gotten into this mold. So unless there's a higher level vision of saying, look, this field is important and it needs people with expertise to be heard. See, for example, look at the COVID. It was a massive crisis. Of course, everybody bungled, everybody ran around. But it was people like Jayaprakash Mulel, Gagandeep Kang. These were people who knew what they were talking about. And they did have an input into policy. In our field, there are so many, it's like more hawk cuckoos than hawks. There's so many expertise. Somebody who's retired from forest department is an expert. That's the only qualification. And there are many other kind of people like that who, I think the yardstick of publications, quality science is not applied in our field. Then there are some of the cases where people leading our own field are academically excellent in very narrow domains. And then they take over and make recommendations about the stuff we talked about which they know very little. So it's a very complex problem. But the bottom line is, unlike IT, BT, telecom, our field doesn't generate money. So that kind of, or national security, like atomic energy, it doesn't generate money, but Raja Ramanna had a seat at the table because that was critical for national security. So we don't have that traction. And leaders in our field, in some sense, I don't think they have, at least for the type of conservation you and I are talking about, they have not forcefully pleaded for it.
Thank you, sir. There's another question, which is a follow-up on the conservation challenges discussion we had a little while ago. And so the question is basically about how do we strike the right balance on balancing, or rather balancing human and wildlife interests side by side in conservation?
This is the most important question, and this was a debate. See, in a sense, how do you balance conservation with development? The first thing is to remember the two are different. Okay, and it was all through history of development and conservation till the 80s. It was recognized that the two activities were different. So the pioneers of conservation said, give us this little piece of land, give us this natural park, do this, and whatever that was allowed or done within that was not development. It was supposed to reduce pressures, reduce development, in some sense, de-development. In the 80s, the environmental movement came into sway. See, before that, it was development people versus conservation people, and a lot of the conservation people were actually hunters. They wanted natural areas because one of their interests was hunting. But the net result was there were natural areas with wildlife. They were not farms. It made that difference. But when the environmentalism came, because of pollution and various other issues, a whole bunch of people got in, and this focused conservation got kind of sidelined. But the fundamental thing we forget is environmentalism is different from conservation. Conservation is about other species. Environmentalism is about making everything habitable and good for one species, that is us, and maybe our cows and dogs and cats and stray dogs that you need to feed, and all this kind of thing is kind of comes under that. So to me, that confounding later led to a confounding between the UN type of agencies like Grove, Harlem, Brundtland, and there was a document called Caring for the Earth, which was produced by WWF, World Resources Institute, and UNEP in '93. Very powerful document, which became accepted because in very sophisticated language, it said conservation and development could happen together at the same place and same time, which was nonsense, but it was fashionable nonsense. So it swept, everybody liked the idea. So John Robinson, my old teacher and boss, took them on in a series of 3 papers called Limits to Caring. And he proposed an alternative. He didn't reject technology. He didn't want what some of the conservationists were saying, we don't want development. Now, he didn't buy that either. But he said, don't confound the two. partition the earth. Someone called it carving up tomorrow's world. Partition it so that you can have intensive development in some places with the most modern technology. You could have the best possible protection given the species and the system, and you would have some gray area in between or a large chunk of the area where you could have both conservation and development. Don't spread this model everywhere. To me, that still remains the rational solution.
I think this also goes back to the one of the discussions that I had attended earlier when Ajay was also there, Ajay Desai, where he was actually bringing up this point about how coexistence is now being fancied and being pushed, pressed upon people, where it may not always be possible for large wildlife and people to actually coexist in an area unless you actually have the right mitigation measures in place. But people and wildlife sharing spaces being regarded as harmonious coexistence also needs to be viewed very carefully, was what his take home was.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, anybody who knows animal natural history and rural people and their lifestyles, it's obvious to us. But a lot of people live in the internet world, in a world disconnected from this, live in urban centers, and they think, a man-eating tiger can go on eating children in a village and it's still fine. They can hold candlelight vigils for the man-eater and all. There's a separate reality out there. But our job is to make sure we build on what we know. And where I differ from a lot of environmentalists or greens or whatever they call, is a lot of them are rejecting technology. To me, when the Earth's population will stabilize at 10 billion, and all those 10 billion will consume like middle class people do in the West, or at least are trying to consume, we do need radically different technological solutions to meet that need. But the plus for me is that the demographic transition from largely agrarian societies, land-dependent societies, millions of cattle. India has 18% of the world's livestock on 2% of its land. All this will go. People will be more urbanized. People will be consuming more, and they will be better fed and better clothed. And 100 years from now, we'll have more space for wildlife. I'm very sure of that. Perhaps even 50 years from now. But before we get there, if you are going to lose whole suite of species, that would be a tragedy. It wouldn't have been a tragedy 50 years ago because we really were poor. I have seen starvation in Karnataka, food from Kansas being imported to Chitradurga to feed people. But we have passed that stage, and if we lose now all these wonderful species like tigers and elephants and hornbills and LTMs or whatever, just when we are on the cusp of solving some of the basic problems, it is only because of lack of clear thinking and a lack of commitment to genuine conservation science.
I think that said, I will still go back to your earlier point that there is still a lot of hope left in conserving India's wild spaces and wildlife. So just before we wrap up this session,
yeah, absolutely. I think I'm a living example. When I was growing up in Puttur, people were shooting tigers and parading them on the streets. We were down to less than 70 or 80 tigers in the entire Malnad landscape. Now there are 400 or at least 350 tigers. Government will always add 200. But whatever, the far more, we have tigers posing for photographers in certain places, and we have rural income. A daily wage laborer's income is 30 to 40 times more. We have shortage of labor for transplanting paddy and picking coffee. Laborers are coming from Assam and Orissa. There has been tremendous economic growth. So I don't see, essentially, these are unsolvable problems. So I'm a living proof. I have seen this transition, not messily handled. I'm not saying it's handled completely correctly, but there is no need to lose hope at all. I'm very sure of that.
So I think before we wrap up on that hopeful note, there's one last very interesting question which I think a lot of people might also be interested in. I'm just going to take an extra minute for this particular question.
Sure.
So this question is, why was this logo chosen in particular?
Oh, CWS logo. I have tried to change it. My daughter doesn't allow it. So anyway, the story behind it is, I saw in 1974, I was driving through Bhagavati. I had gone because some farmers in what is now the Kudremukh mining township, I heard that a tiger had made 5 kills. Some local planter, I heard through, and I rushed on my motorcycle, persuaded those Jain farmers not to put solid or poison those carcasses, because it was the first time we were seeing some evidence of outside of Nagarhole and Bandipur. Even there, they were very good. So after that, a timber merchant I knew, I hopped on his truck and went into Bhagavati, what is today the highway. It was just a mud road, and on the way back, I saw a large civet with an injury on its tail walking on the road, and someone threw something, stone or something at it, it scurried away, but I was very sure it was the Malabar civet. It's much larger than the smaller civet, but I didn't realize what it was. In 1984, when I went to Front Royal, Chris Wemmer said, this is important. You please write a note about it. Whether they were, why, I mean, if you look at all the 19th century literature, that species was found everywhere. And now we are finding the other civet all over. I don't think they are specialists. They are generalists. They were there at low densities, maybe. So anyway, so when I started CWS in 84, and Chris had just come from the Front Royal, I said, why don't I make a logo of it? And Helmut Diller, who was a painter who used to I was a volunteer. I was pushing chairs in WWF from 1971. And we used to sell greeting cards to raise money for WWF. So Helmut Diller had made a beautiful painting of the Malabar civet from skins or whatever. So I chose that. I had a Jeep, and one painter called Suryanarayana copied it nicely. I said, twist the tail a little so it doesn't look like a copy of Helmut Diller. So then we made a black and white logo of it. And I wanted to change it many times as our folks shifted to tigers. But, Kriti is chief scientist now, and she doesn't want the logo changed.
Thank you, sir. I think this was indeed a wonderful and exciting session, because there were a lot of things I'm sure people really wanted to hear from you on how this organization grew over the years. How it all started and how it grew over the years, with particular focus on the tiger conservation initiatives over 30 plus years, and the way forward and conservation challenges and so on. So before we wrap up, I'd really like to thank you on behalf of our entire webinar organizing team for sparing this hour and a half almost to share some of your fantastic experiences with us. Thank you so much, sir.
Sure, Sreedhar. Thanks for everybody. So many good names I'm seeing on the screen. I'm grateful so many people are interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants as well for this session and being online throughout. So once again, I thank you, thank everyone for attending this session. Thank you.